Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is James Kramer. I am an international ferry pilot. I deliver little singles and twin engine aircraft around the world. Furthest that I've been to the east from the United States is to Thailand, and the furthest west that I have been is to Gimpo in Seoul, Korea. How many pilots this morning? And wannabe pilots, obviously. All right. For those of you who are pilots, I want you to put this thought into your brain. I want you to think about the longest cross country that you've ever taken. Both one stop, just the longest leg that you have ever taken, and the longest trip you have ever made. Just put that in your brain. I'm going to be talking about going beyond power-off gliding distance. Anybody know what that's referencing? You know what FAR that might be? I know, I had to look it up. I forgot. FAR 91.205 talks about the equipment, the supplies that you have to have on board. It's a little different with a private aircraft than, say, for an airliner. But it definitely takes a lot of planning when you're getting ready to take a little single-engine plane over the ocean. This is most of my stuff, and I'll show you a little bit more here in a minute. Anybody see Captain Judy leave yesterday? Okay, she's getting ready to go around the world to promote STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And if you go to her website, thinkglobalflight.org, you can see more about what she's getting ready to do. She's going to like 24 different countries. And they're going to be having students, some of the guys from the academy here, and schools all around the world following that trip. So, again, I want you to think about that longest flight. Being the museum, I would be remiss if I didn't do a little history. So here's your question for the morning. Who was the first to cross the Atlantic? Okay, most people are going to answer Charles Lindbergh in 1927. He was the first solo nonstop to cross the Atlantic. The first people, had to be tricky about the way I worded the question. The first people that crossed the Atlantic nonstop were Alcock and Brown. That was 8 years before Charles Lindbergh in 1919. There's a story in a book called Transatlantic that talks about their journey across. The worst thing that happened to them, according to their stories, were when they were approaching Ireland. I don't know how far west of Ireland they were. They got into some clouds. They got disoriented. They lost control. They pulled out from what I presume is a spin, even though the book didn't say it that way, less than 100 feet above the water. But then they were able to continue on, and they saw Ireland. And boy, I know that feeling. When you've been flying over water for hours and hours and hours, and then you see land, and then you cross the coastline, and you think to yourself, dry feet. Yay. So they saw this beautiful field, beautiful green grass, and they did not have any idea that there were a bunch of bogs in Ireland. They didn't make a very graceful landing, but they made the first transatlantic nonstop crossing. Then, of course, we all are familiar with Amelia, and there is a woman right now that's getting ready to go around the world again with her name. She's adopted her name. And that was in 1937. So a few years later, from all the other people going across. And I have to mention someone else from 1937. A little more history from Lakeland. This is my mom. In 1937, she soloed after 2 hours and 55 minutes of instruction. And it was on the north end of town at the old Lodwick Field. There were 2 airports here in Lakeland. And up on the north end of town by the big lake that you might have flown over when you came in, if you flew in, Lake Parker, there's an old airport that has been since shut down called Lodwick Field. Anyway, she got instructed by an acquaintance of her father's. Okay, my grandfather worked for the post office. And the gentleman in the picture, okay, that gentleman right there used to fly the airmail, the actual airmail, when it was something different other than just every mail going across the country goes in the cargo holds. But he was the flying postman of Lakeland. Well, it made the newspapers. As you can see there, it says Seattle Post, solo flyer, a natural. Well, that was a great feat, but same in 1937, it's illegal to solo before you're 16. So her instructor had his instructor's rating pulled for 90 days. And in those 90 days in 1937, and that was in May 20th, so the May 19th is when she soloed, Amelia Earhart went missing at the first part of July. So that was within the 90 days. So I'm not sure why my mom never finished her license when she was that age, or other than the fact that it was going to take too long. But she did end up finishing, and I'll tell you about that in just a second. So now, after all those people, came World War II. And Europe, England needed the bombers and the fighters as quickly as possible. Well, they were losing a bunch of the fighters that were being put on ships because of the German U-boats sinking those ships. So they decided they needed to do something different for the fighters and the bombers. So they decided that they were going to start flying them across. Well, it's the same thing that people ask me when I get to where I'm going. Why don't they just create these little Cessna 172s, Cessna 182s, Senecas, whatever. And when a plane comes from the factory, it is tweaked to be perfect, or as close to perfect as they can get. So now you're going to take apart a perfectly good airplane, take it over the ocean, after putting it in a crate, and you've seen pictures of the oceans. You can get 20, 30-foot seas out there, and those crates don't keep those planes' parts safe, and they get damaged sometimes en route. So now you have a damaged aircraft when it gets across, or aircraft parts. So they decided, we're going to fly them. It takes less time. If you take an airplane apart, put it on a ship, take it across, if it makes it, and then put it back together again, you're talking 2.5, 3 weeks. I'm getting ready to go over to Marseille, France, and pick up a Cessna 400 and bring it westbound because somebody bought it over here. But it's only going to take me, with good weather, about 5 days. Comfortably 5 days for me to fly, and I'll show you the routing that I normally take. Well, after the airplanes got to England, in Prestwick, they had to get down to the frontline air bases in Europe, in England. So all the guys were where? They were flying missions over Germany already. So they had a bunch of women that came, be called the Spitfire women, to take the planes to the frontline bases. We also had a lot of females that were part of the RAF Ferry Command, bringing the planes across the North Atlantic. Okay, how long was that first long cross country that you ever made? This is my first crossing I ever made. Back almost 6 years ago, June, and this was June 17th, because I will never forget, because it was Independence Day in Iceland. So it was sort of like they had a big party for me when I arrived. Okay. But this, and you can see up top, and this, I'll give a plug for 4Flight. This is 4Flight. Love it. Works real well. You can see up here, 1,334 nautical miles nonstop direct. Prince Christian Sound is right here, little NDB right on the southern tip. And the first time I was getting ready to do this, wanted to do this trip, the day before, I didn't like the winds. Looked at the forecast the night that I got up to Goose Bay, which is CYYR. So got to Goose Bay after leaving Maine. Bangor's right about in there. 5-hour trip up to Goose Bay. When I got up there, the forecast for the winds were iffy. I like to have 2.5 to 3 hours reserved when I am going across a big body of water like that. It's a little bit different nowadays with the GPS. You can cut it a little bit closer because you're not going to be approaching Europe and going, oh, I need to fly 2 hours that way to get to the airport I was going to. All right, so I looked at the winds that next morning, that first morning that I was trying to get across, and I just decided with my supervisor pilot, I had to go with somebody that was supervising me because you can't just hop into a plane and do this. There's too many things that you need to know when you're crossing. There's too many pitfalls. So I said, I'm not comfortable. And he said, okay, let's go back to the hotel. So we both went to our rooms, stared at the weather for the next 24 hours, got back out to the airport and went the next day. So how does the Cessna 172 get all the way across? This is a tanking that was done here in Lakeland at Globe Aero, where I got my start as a ferry pilot. That is a 30-gallon tank where the co-pilot's seat used to be. And behind in the passenger seat is a 55-gallon tank. So now I have an additional 85 gallons on top of what's the 172? About 85 gallons now. The new ones anyway, I think, or somewhere around 85. I forgot. Something like that. Doubles the amount of fuel. Gives me about, if I remember correctly, about 16 hours of endurance, maybe longer. 16. Yeah, something like 16. But that's running it dry. All right, so there's little pumps right there that are bolted onto the floor, and that pumps it up into a T in the fuel line, and what doesn't get taken into the engine gets pushed back up into the right wing. So I have to, there's a lot of things you need to know before you even think about taking a plane across. This is the actual landing, the picture that they took. Because you see all those people on the left there? That is a flying club that bought this aircraft. They were happy to get that airplane that day. This is a couple of days. This is, I guess it was the next day after Reykjavik. When I was on final approach, I'm looking over to the left, and on top of little buildings on the side of the runway, there are people jumping up and down and waving their hands, and they are all excited and taking pictures. And thankfully, it was a nice landing. And those wheels are that far off the ground just before touching down. They were following along. They knew one of the air traffic controllers in Iceland, and he called them in Norway and said, your airplane's on the way. We think it's yours anyway. November 6539. Yeah, 6539. This was in June. What's that on the leading edge of that step? Ice. June. Up over Norway, I believe, is where that was. Or it could have been, I can't remember where I took that picture exactly, because I have this real bad habit of finding ice wherever I go. One of the other ferry pilots that's traveled with me, calls me Iceman. If you look at the top left, let me give you a little history about this flight real quick. And speaking of nonstop transatlantic single-engine flights, on September, and this is just by coincidence, guys, on September 11th, 2010, I made a nonstop transatlantic flight in a Cessna 172 with really, really good tailwinds from St. John's, Newfoundland, to Sligo, Ireland. And I ended up in the newspaper and then flying an Ireland magazine. They did a story about me. But the next day, I was trying to get this plane to just outside of Strasbourg, France. And if you remember about, I want to say this was 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, there was really bad storms that shut down Europe, snowstorms that shut down Charles de Gaulle and Paris, everywhere. England got shut down, every place. Well, the day before they started shutting down the airports, this was the day I was flying, and I was approaching London from Ireland, flying over Dublin. And you know when you're flying along and you're looking out thinking, are those clouds getting higher? Am I going to have to climb? And yeah, when you're worried about icing conditions, because the freezing level at that day was down at 3,000 feet, just below 3,000, about 2,800 feet. Well, I'm looking ahead thinking, I might have to climb. So, prepared my oxygen, and then wham, I'm in the clouds, and I am packing on the ice rapidly. Now, let me caution you, for those of you who are pilots that have possibly never gotten into icing, don't do it. Make sure you have an out. I had a freezing level of 3,000 feet. I knew I had somewhere to go. I could always turn around. I called London and said, I need to descend now. And they said, you're cleared to descend down to 9,000 feet, flight level 090, education time. Transition level in the United States is what? When you switch to standard pressure? 18,000, right. You go, now it's flight level 180. All right, in Europe, and well, actually everywhere but the United States pretty much, there's something called the transition level, not at 18,000, like you might think that everybody else does it in the world because America does it. It can be anywhere from 4,000, 5,000 feet, 6,000 feet. That's where they change over to standard pressure. So they cleared me down to flight level 090, which wasn't low enough, obviously. I was still in the clouds. I had gone from 107 knots indicated down to 88 knots indicated because of all of that ice. And that's already melted off some. I didn't think about the pictures and taking camera until the other two parts of the wings had already broken off. But finally, after about, probably took about a minute for the ice to melt, and then finally, and if you go to YouTube, and I have some cards up here, if you want to, I have a link through my website. If you want to look at the ice actually coming off and just chunk off, you can see it. It's abbreviation for Captain, C-A-P-T, C-R-E-A-M-E-R on YouTube, Captain Kramer. That was scary. That's the worst I've ever been in. But again, just be careful when you're planning. There's so many things that you've got to take into consideration. One of the previous owners of Globe Aero, Phil Waldman, he owned and managed Globe Aero here in town after it got brought down from the Piper factory up in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania. He continued ferrying airplanes out of here. And one of the things that he told me just recently, the one thing that kills all pilots is the ego. Anybody getting ready to fly north, getting ready to go home, like maybe tomorrow, tonight? No? Okay, good. Because if you're paying attention to the weather, there's a bunch of bad stuff right up in the middle of the United States coming towards the Rockies right now. Don't let your ego make you, I've got to go, because it's going to kill you. 1 in 300 flights of ferry pilots, so, and I'm not talking deliveries, 1 in 300 of the flights that the ferry pilots make, on average, the ferry pilot dies. It's a very, very dangerous profession. This is my first winter crossing. It was December of 2008, and the weather wasn't allowing me to go, and I was taking my time. In fact, I took 13 days before the weather was acceptable at departure point of Goose Bay, Narsarsuaq in southern Greenland, which, if you've read Ernest K. Gahn's book, Fate is the Hunter, he mentions Bluey West 1, and that's the military base, and it's Narsarsuaq. Or the weather was bad in Reykjavik. So I waited for 13 days. This is about halfway through. In December, the temperature in Goose Bay was going from -35 to +5 Celsius. -35, +5, -35, +5, rain, snow, rain, snow, rain, snow. That's about 1 week in. So I have another week. There was that much ice on the plane, and it cost $2,000 to de-ice a Cessna 172. I think that was a 172. Yeah. I didn't realize what I was doing in my first winter crossing. I learned to fly in Florida. I didn't think about pushing the airplane into a hangar that was warm. Would have been a lot cheaper. After I got that plane de-iced and I made that crossing, no problem. I think I fought a little more ice. Mechanical problems. You see the cowling off of that Warrior, Archer, whatever they call it. This is my fourth crossing. Fourth crossing, what was it, August of 2008. And I had tanks in the aircraft, and I'm going from Goose Bay, again, to Reykjavik. That was my normal route. I got 175 nautical miles from Greenland, and my alternator quit. So there goes the GPS. No, I still had battery power. But I had to, what do you do? Turn everything off, except one radio. And of course, I have handhelds and stuff, and I'll show you some of the stuff here in just a second. But I was very fortunate that day that there were 7 other planes with me in Goose Bay. It used to be very, very busy sometimes when there were a lot of planes being sold overseas. But there were 7 airplanes that were taking off all around me. I think 5 of them took off in front of me, and 2 of them took off behind me. Most of those guys were going into Narsarsuaq because they did not have tanks. But I was surrounded by a bunch of fellow pilots ferrying airplanes. I was very happy to know that because it's a very warm, fuzzy feeling. Because when you're out over the Atlantic by yourself, it's scary. Oh yeah. I was there for 11 days waiting for the alternator and battery acid and regulator to show up. And anybody know who Freddie Cabanas is? He used to do races in Reno, and he used to do rides here in his pits. Well, if you saw any history about him, and I think you can look this up online in YouTube also, there was a presentation about him ferrying that Sky Raider right there. That's an old military Sky Raider that he was ferrying across. So I met Freddie there, and he sort of was laughing at me with my bad alternator. He said he had 18 gallons of oil in a drum in the back of his Sky Raider. He said he thought he could make it all the way to Goose Bay with enough oil, 14 gallons. Anyway, this picture here was after I had the alternator repaired, and I wanted to do a flight right around Narsassuac for about an hour to make sure that the alternator was going to keep working, and I was not going to have any troubles down the road. Then when I was getting ready to leave, I asked them, how can I cut off some distance? What's the safest way to go? Because usually I went straight across. I never stopped in Narsassuac, so I had to get some local information. So they said, okay, when you leave, come out. And they showed me on a map. They said, okay, Narsassuac is right up that fjord. They said, come on out the fjord. Or come on. Come out the fjord around these mountains that are right in here, the higher peaks. And they said about 9,000 feet you'll be fine, and you can come out this fjord right there called the Lindenau Fjord. And if you're good spatially, looking at maps and looking outside, and you can see on the Garmin 296, there's the plane right there, and you see this little branch of the fjord right there? That's that one, right there. And that's ice flowing down into the fjord. And then this other picture is looking straight down this fjord, and I'm getting ready to do another 650 nautical miles to Reykjavik. Okay, now we're going to get to the longest ferry flight that I have ever taken, or the longest ones. The first crossing of the Pacific I did was in a Cessna 206 with some very large ferry tanks. I think I have some pictures, maybe not. I can find the pictures maybe. But it was a Cessna 206 with two 120-gallon tanks inside. That's up to here. I think I might actually have a picture in here. It is nearly, I'll just say it, it's an average of 2,100 nautical miles to Hawaii from anywhere in California. 20,053 miles, something like that, up to 2,150 something. To give you an idea of the distance, here's Lakeland, there's Santa Monica. That is 1,850 some odd nautical miles direct. So that flight down to Hawaii was further. That was more like going to Washington State from here, nonstop. The first flight that I took was 16 and a half hours. Let me see if I have that picture. Yeah, I do. Okay, good. 16 and a half hours in that aircraft. They moved my airplane after getting it fueled, when they fueled it in Santa Monica, and I believe this is where the damage occurred. Nobody could figure it out. Nobody wanted to admit to it. But when you fill these tanks in these airplanes, this airplane was certified over gross by 30%. So I was taking off 130% maximum gross weight. And with that tank in the co-pilot's, or in the pilot, behind the pilot's seat, I'm pretty aft CG. The airplane's tail sits about a foot off the ground. So when I was taxiing out, I was full of fuel. I had over 300 and some odd gallons, 350 gallons of fuel in a 206. When I landed in Kona and the nose wheel touched. The nose wheel was sideways, and I started veering towards the side of the runway. After 16 and a half hours of flying, it's dark again. I took off at 7 o'clock in the morning out of Santa Monica and landed at 8:30 at night and almost wrecked. Told the tower controller, hold on a second. She said, is everything okay? I said, hold on a second. I've been in the air for a little while. And she reads the strip on that she got telling them that I was coming in, and she saw how much time had elapsed, and she said, you can come up to the tower anytime you want. So I went up and visited, and they were amazed. But these are two 120-gallon tanks, and not much room for anything else, not much room to turn around and change your mind. So let's see. I'll show you this stuff at the end. This is my equipment here.
What was the landing gear was broke? The nose wheel?
They had turned my nose gear too far. Thank you. Sorry about that. They had turned my nose gear too far, and with the tail sitting so low and the front strut being extended so much, there's a little safety that is a shear bolt on the nose gear. And if I had been really careful with my notes, I would have seen that I was traveling an average of 3 knots slower than from Wichita to California. I would have caught that. Nowadays, I will, because I know I keep very good records, and I'll show you that in just a few minutes. But got that fixed in 5 days, and then continued on to Tarpa and Saipan up to Gimpo up in Seoul. This is the wind chart for an SR-20, the morning of an SR-20 Cirrus that I was getting ready to take to Maui from Livermore, California. So, talking of planning, you can't have any headwinds in an SR-20 because you can't put enough fuel in an SR-20 to go much further than Hawaii. Hawaii is at the end of that line right there. There's the big island if you can see it. And I was coming out of Livermore. So right in here, if you look, looks like what, 5 knots on the head maybe? That's one of the 5-knot barbs. And you get a little bit further and it should be light and variable, and then it's going to start coming around to maybe 20 knots on the head. Well, by the time I got out to about 750 nautical miles, I was looking at my computer doing all the work from my brain, and it was telling me I had winds that were 130 knots, 130 degrees at 30 knots directly across. I got on my satellite phone, called Honolulu. Flight service down there told me the front moved a little bit faster than we expected. Yay. I start doing my calculations. I keep very good records. Some people have asked, what do you do in 16 and a half hours? Well, every 30 minutes, I keep track, and you can see some of them in the larger print, but if you look up, you can see manifold inches, RPM, all these parameters. The most important ones right here are, what is the fuel selector on? Right tank and left tank, aft tank, co-pilot tank. Remaining time that's available with the fuel, required time. All right, and right here you can see turnaround, 2151 Zulu. I took off, I started the engine at 1425 Zulu and took off at 7 a.m., 15 Zulu from California. And when I talked to flight service and they said that it was going to be 35 knot headwinds, well, let's see. Do I have the ground speed indicated? Ground speed, I was doing about 130, looks like 135. And if I was going to get 35 knot headwinds, I'm now going to be doing 100 nautical miles an hour for the rest of the trip down to Hawaii. And if you look right here, distance at 2035 is 1,300 nautical miles. And I had 13.5 hours of fuel remaining. I turned around and made a 14-hour local cross-country out of Livermore, California. 14 hours, and I never got anywhere. 11 more days before the winds would allow me to take off and try the trip again, and I did make it on that second trip. Here's another trip that I had to make some decisions on. This is an SR-22 just about 2 months ago that I took over to Czech Republic. And this particular day is out of Sundström, also known, I'm not going to try to butcher the name. They have some very strange names in Greenland. The wind charts forecast showed the eastern half, okay, from right about where I was there to just offshore, it was showing 45 knot headwinds, decreasing to just offshore of Iceland, decreasing down to 10 to 15 knots. So it would gradually get slower. Well, the weather that I had to consider at an airport that would be my return point was Kulisuk. I called the gentleman there that I know because I've been through there. I actually met him in Narsarsuaq when he was stationed there. And I talked to Soren and I said, how's the weather today? And he said, it's a little crappy this morning, but it's supposed to get better. So what I decided was take off, get halfway across Greenland, see how the winds are. Get to the east coast of Greenland and see if the winds are starting to decrease. See how the weather is down in Kulisuk. So I called him on the radio, and he said, oh yeah, weather's improving, 1,600 broken, the winds are down to 38 knots. Yay, okay. But it was doable. So I decided to press on to right about here is about 30 degrees west of longitude. That was going to be my decision point. Am I going to keep going at that point? How many of you guys fly Garmin? What, like 1,000? You have any experience with the Garmin 1000? You see right here? Right, those letters right there are FOD, fuel over destination. And that little number right there is surrounded in red. It's -8 gallons. All right, so when I'm sitting over the middle of Greenland, the Garmin is telling me I have -8 gallons at destination. This is where the pre-flight planning is very, very, very important. You have to know what's going on up there. And this is an untanked Cirrus SR-22. So I only have 8 hours at best economy in an SR-22. 8.5 hours if you push it. I made it. We kept going. It was good enough weather. The winds did decrease, and everything went okay. All right? Going back to those charts that I have where I can make some decisions from by looking at these. Flight that I made in November was in a Corvallis 350, Cessna 350 from Antwerp, Belgium. Some considerations that I make, or I take, before I go across the ocean, especially in a used aircraft, but now even in new aircraft, I like to see a current compression test of the cylinders. I supervised and even helped with the compression test of this Corvallis I was standing right there when the A&P on this side said, everything's tight over here. And his assistant said, everything's tight over here. And they put the cowling on, and I flew to Prestwick, Scotland. Went okay. Flew up to Iceland, to Reykjavik. Went okay. Took off out of Reykjavik the next day. Climbed up to 10,000 feet. And expected to lean the airplane engine out to about 12 gallons an hour. 11.7, I think, is what I was averaging. I got down to 14 gallons an hour, and the engine backfired. Bam! Put the fuel back in, got it back up to about 20 gallons an hour, and I turned around. After I looked at the gauges, let's see, what do we show here on this one? Anyway, the gauges in the Garmin on the engine page, come on. Oh, wow, I'm going backwards, aren't I? Never mind. The gauges in the Garmin show all of your engine parameters, and the oil pressure and the oil temperature were shaking now. Keeping those files that I have and paying attention to the engine, I knew something was different. You know, how many of you guys have taken off in a rental plane or your personal airplane, and you don't look at a thing except maybe the fuel gauges if it's a long flight? You don't look at a thing until you get to where you're going, and maybe even then you don't even look at it. You might glance at things. But I knew from paying attention to the engine and keeping those meticulous records that something was wrong. When I got back on final to Reykjavik, they said, don't want you to be alarmed. We rolled the equipment for you. So the fire trucks and ambulance were sitting off the side on the taxiway. He didn't want me to be alarmed. Those guys know me over there because there's only about maybe 15 of us that do this in the world all the time, that move all of the little single engine and all the little twin engine aircraft around the world. So they recognize my voice. I have a very distinct voice on the radio. Right here is a good lesson for everybody in waiting. Don't let your ego or get their itis make you go so badly that you crash. Have you ever noticed that when the NTSB is on scene, that it's a beautiful day? The next day is always beautiful. I just did, the last plane I did was to Venice, Italy. It was a SR-22. And I was up in Holland. And at noon, the METAR, the actual weather down in Padova, was 200 broken, 300 overcast, quarter-mile visibility. And it wasn't forecasted to get any better the whole day. And I told the gentleman that I was flying with in another SR-22, I'm staying. Because my SR-22 didn't have the TKS fluid wings, the Fiki wings, because it was going to United Arab Emirates. And they really don't worry about icing too much down there. So that was just added drag. And actually, I did go faster than him. We had identical airplanes, but mine had no Fiki distribution on the leading edge of the wings. So I actually averaged a couple of knots faster than him. But he, go, go, go. Said, you've got the Fiki, I don't. I'm gonna wait until tomorrow. Because you know what, a hotel room and food is a lot cheaper than dying. And also not delivering the airplane. So make sure you take your time. Don't let your ego kill you. This is my next airplane that I'm picking up next week. This is a Corvallis 400, Cessna 400. And this is my proposed routing. I'm going to be picking the plane up in Marseille, France, for nice VAT, or value-added tax-free fuel, I'm going to go, come on, up to Guernsey Island, the Channel Islands, one of the pirate islands in between France and England. And then Prestwick, Reykjavik, if I need to. There's Kullesuit that I mentioned before, Sundestrom, Frobisher Bay or Iqaluit. This is Le Grand. Down to Chicago, because I have a friend that helps me after I've finished with my raft, and I have dangerous items. And like I said, I'm going to show you that real quick here next. He's going to help me get my equipment back up to Duluth. And then I'm going to deliver this down to Texas. Okay, a couple of considerations, a few questions that I had from yesterday. What happens when I get to where I'm going and I have all those tanks in the airplanes? They rip them out and I'll leave them there. Sometimes they get used coming back. It just depends on who is doing the flight, what the airplane is. They can use them in different airplanes, but the airplane or the ferry tanks will be left behind and the seats will be reinstalled. Sometimes I'm very fortunate to be able to have a ferry flight in both directions if the timing works out, but otherwise I just take an airline home. You know, I know it seems real obvious to me anyway, but yes, I just come home on an airliner. If you take another little teaching here, teaching episode, if you take all of the variables that you have to think about, the weather, the winds, the airplane, how much fuel you have, how tired you are, how many days you've been flying, how many days are you going to be flying. If you remove all of or minimize those variables, you can pay attention to your flying, the airplane. If you're staring at the fuel gauges because you're worried about not having enough fuel to get to your destination, you're not paying attention to your airplane. Okay, what do I have with me when I'm crossing? Well, if I'm not going to make it, and I've already pre-inflated the top here. Here, let me put this up here. If I am not going to make it and I ditch, I have this bag here, and actually, this was a great idea. Anybody recognize that? Anybody a surfer? It's a surf strap. If I'm going down and I'm wearing my immersion suit, this is a Gumby suit, immersion suit, dry suit, poo-poo suit. This is what I would be wearing because the North Atlantic is really, really cold. And useful consciousness, if you're lucky during the winter, maybe a minute or two. This is my one of my rafts. This is the out of the bag version. Come on. Oh, I knew this was going to happen. Well. Oh, only one of them inflated. Well, just like on the airlines, you have the little tube to inflate it. This is what I would be sitting in, a one-man life raft, if I have to ditch out in the water. So I would be in an immersion suit, in this, bailing the bottom out. That's to help me keep upright. So I'd be sitting in this thing, waiting, hopefully, for the Coast Guard to arrive. They did tell me one time, I was up in Gander, Newfoundland, and we were sitting around, and I went to one of the guys from Elizabeth City Coast Guard Station that was up there in training. And I said, look, if I go down halfway to Europe, are you going to come get me? And he said, yes. We will launch a helicopter and a tanker, and we will be on the way. But he said the odds are you're going to get picked up by a Good Samaritan ship first, because they're going to be pointing everybody in the area to come get you. I carry a ditch bag that I have first aid kit, signal mirror, dye pack, you name it, I have a couple little things in there. I have this bag that's always ready to go with me that I would put through this strap on my leg. EPIRB. While I'm flying, Spot Connect. No, I don't have any stock in the company. Strobe light. For the tanked airplanes, I have a digital CO2 monitor and low-level explosives or fumes monitor to make sure that nothing is leaking inside the airplane. I have a handheld VHF, handheld marine radio, so that I can talk to the ship coming to rescue me. When I'm in the little airplanes that have high altitude capabilities, this is a little oximeter, pulse oximeter. You don't think about these things. Here's another, and my second carbon monoxide monitor. He's asking what percentage of oxygen do you look for? Well, fortunately, my mom that you saw in the picture earlier was an anesthesiologist. And I worked with her, and we had pulse oximeters on the fingers in surgery. So you want to be at least 90%. It's always best to be higher. I've seen it get down to in the mid-80s, but then if you do a special breathing, the Kegel breathing, you increase the partial pressure. That's a whole big science class, but you cram more oxygen into the lungs, and it helps you increase your oxygen level. Any other questions? Think. Let's see. I showed you all that.
How many ferry runs do you do in a year?
Very good. Okay, thank you. She asked, how many ferry runs do you do in a year? I have been averaging about 1 per month. I have 3 this month. So sometimes it's feasts and sometimes it's famine. I've been to 41 countries under my own power. I have a little flag, the little flags like that. I have that set up on some of my shelves at home with a flag for each country in order that I've been to. I've instructed in 4 countries now total. Here, Canada, when I got to Gimpo over in Seoul, Korea, and one time in Spain, Palma de Mallorca.
The aviation language is English everywhere, right?
Yes, aviation language everywhere pretty much except for China. When you're delivering an airplane there, I've never personally delivered one there, but when you deliver a plane to China, you have to stop at the first airport on the border and get a local pilot so they can talk to the tower and route controllers. Yes, usually don't have any trouble. Usually have no trouble with communication. And they hear the yank on the radio, and they cut you a little slack. They know that you're out of your territory. But I've had a total of 56 Atlantic crossings. 25 of those were 172s. And I've been all the way across the Pacific once and 2 more flights to Hawaii. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you notice a large difference based on the aircraft when it comes to fatigue and vibrations? Like you're in an aircraft that has some vibrations, you find yourself fatiguing out?
He's asking, does the longer trip in the smaller aircraft, with all of the vibration, and yes, they do vibrate more than an airliner, but I've never really noticed any difference. It's the sheer terror of the possibility of dying when you're ferrying these airplanes keeps me awake. I stay very focused on what I'm doing. Any other questions?
If you're in that suit and you're in your raft, how long can you last out there?
Okay, he's asking if I'm in the suit, in the raft, how long can I last? I'm going to last as long as I possibly can. I'm not going to give up. I think I mentioned possibly that Freddie Cabanas, maybe I didn't say this. Freddie Cabanas told me, just nose her over. Auger her right into the water because you're going to die anyway. I'm not going to allow that to happen if I possibly can. As long as I can survive a fixed gear ditching and I flip over and I can get out the door, I'm going to do the best I can with all this equipment that I have. And that's why I carry it. There are some ferry pilots that don't bring this equipment. They've been doing it for several years, 10 years. They figure, oh well.
Well, you can last a long time without food, but you have to have water.
Yeah, good, thank you. Food. On those long trips, yes. Before I leave the United States, I get several bags of beef jerky and a 12-pack of water. And I'm going to have as much as I can stuff into this bag. I'm going to stuff as much stuff with me, and I'm going to survive as long as I possibly can. Yes, sir.
How do you prepare for ditching? Let's say especially with fixed gear, every plane is different.
Right.
Or what?
How do you prepare for ditching? Well, you used to have to go to a class in Canada. They used to require before you ever ferried an aircraft. They don't do that anymore. Now, thank you for reminding me, because I need to say that the gentleman that provided this extra life raft, Randy Boone, Aviation and Marine Survival Technologies. He does a course that helps you learn how to put on your Gumby suit in the water, or if you already have it on, or after you get it on, how to climb into the raft, whether it's a one-man raft or a six-man raft, a four-man raft, or whatever. I have done lots of research, and I've talked to a lot of ferry pilots about how to approach the ditching if you're in a fixed gear. There's books out there that you can get to read, and I have talked to so many ferry pilots. There's a big turnover, unfortunately, but the guys that I've been working with for the last 6 years, what else do we have to do when we're out in the middle of the Atlantic? We're not going to be bugging anybody else on the frequency usually. We talk to each other and we go through scenarios. That's how you learn. I mean, I'm sure everybody in here that's a pilot, most of you, have learned something from the hangar flying, the hours and hours that you have sat in hangars with your fellow pilot friends, that you've learned something to help keep you alive. Any other questions? Yes? Oh boy, the engine problems? Ooh, I need to start wrapping this up, but I'll get up. Probably the worst engine problem I had real quickly was a Saratoga that I took off out of Gander. Great people in Gander. Town doubled during 9/11. They took care of everybody. They were perfect. But I had a Saratoga that I took off that had been sitting for 5 or 6 years. For some reason, when they overhauled the engine, they replaced 1 through 5 and honed and reinstalled 6. Don't know why. Stupid. Yeah, it was. Waste, how dumb. But climbed up, I got up to flight level 190 in the Saratoga, got my oxygen going, and I'm leaning her out, and then I start noticing the engine starting to misfire. all noises of the engine are amplified over water, if you've never noticed. You notice them very quickly. But on the third backfire, or not backfire, just roughness, I started looking at the gauges, and the one cylinder that hadn't been replaced was failing. So I had to turn around and go back. That was with a 50-knot tailwind, and it took me a while to get to flight level 190, so I was already about 150 nautical miles offshore, now fighting a 50-knot headwind. So that was real comfortable. So, anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming and listening to Beyond Power Off Gliding Distance. James Kramer. If you want to look a little bit more about me on my website, there's some business cards up here. And if anybody's ever interested in crossing, like one gentleman here has been talking with me, if you want to be supervised, because you won't be covered by your insurance company if you try to do this without any experience. If you want to have a supervised trip, then I'd be happy to do that for you. Or there's also, I can't remember the name of the company, there's another one here that does the Air Journey. Air Journey. So thank you for listening. Enjoy the rest of the flying.